Welcome friends, welcome back to the kitchen, welcome back to Sunday morning in the old cookbook show. Today we're going to do a recipe out of this cookbook. This is the 1892 edition of the Galt Cookbook. This is the first edition of the Galt Cookbook. And this is a community cookbook. This was a fundraiser for the Presbyterian Church in Galt. And so they got together and the community came together and they all gave recipes in to make this cookbook. And it must have been a massive undertaking to put this book together. There's a lot of recipes in it, and the book did extremely well. There weren't too many copies of this first edition, but it went almost immediately into a second edition, and there were editions printed of this book all the way until about 1920. And even today, you can buy reproduction copies of it based on one of the later editions. It's called the New Galt Cookbook by that point. And a lot of the information that I have about this book comes from this book. If you collect cookbooks in Canada, this is the first book that you need to collect, and it is called Culinary Landmarks. The author of this book, again, went through this monumental task of finding every, or as many as every, cookbooks printed in Canada between 1825 and 1949. Pretty much almost every cookbook printed in Canada during that time period is in there. And she goes into great detail about the books, who wrote them, who printed them, and how many are left. And in most cases, there aren't too many left. There aren't too many of this first edition that are known to be left. And there's one there. And my copy is in pretty good shape. It needs to be rebound, but it's not fantastic. So anyway, today the recipe we're going to do is called coffee cake. It is a yeasted coffee cake. The recipe asks for 2 cakes of fresh Fleischmann's yeast, and I don't have fresh yeast. So I took some regular yeast and I've just put it in a little bit of water so that it can dissolve, because I find that instant yeast, or the yeast that we have today, the dry yeast, doesn't dissolve too well in milk and butter, which are the first 2 ingredients. And if you look at the recipe, it calls for amounts in coffee cups and small teacups. This was a community cookbook. And as such, all of the recipes would just be grabbed from people in the community, and they would have used whatever measuring devices they had in their kitchen, and they wouldn't have changed them to be in this cookbook. So once again, I'm left trying to figure out coffee cups and small teacups and just trying to make it work. So that was sugar that went in, that was milk and melted butter, and now I'm putting in some raisins. And so I'm going to say, for this recipe, whatever size cup you decide to use at the beginning doesn't really matter. I chose to say that a coffee cup is 150 milliliters. What you use doesn't really matter, because they don't tell you how much flour to use. They just tell you to use enough flour to make a dough. So the amount of liquid, inconsequential. You just keep adding flour until you can knead it. But it did lead me down a rabbit hole. I've had a number of people over the last little while, 4 people in particular, who have consistently emailed me over and over and over to admonish me for not knowing that there are only 2 sizes of teacup that were ever used in Canada. They were either 6 ounces or 8 ounces, and I should have known this. So this morning, I went down to the equipment room and took 24 teacups, 24 different teacups that we have in boxes downstairs. Pulled out a cup from each set, filled them with water, and checked what size they are. None of them were 6 ounces, none of them were 8 ounces. None of them. And for the sizes that they were wildly inconsistent. And there were very few that were the same size. And when I did find ones that were the same size, even though they were from different sets, they were from the same manufacturer. So any recipe that tells you to do something in coffee cups or teacups, you're just going to have to make it up. There is no consistency. And all of the confusion over cup sizes and amounts and measuring for recipes starts to change when the Fanny Farmer Cookbook is released in 1896. And it advocated for standard measurements like the measuring cup, even though the measuring cup isn't standard. Canada and the United States have different size measuring cups, always have, probably always will. Japan has a different size measuring cup. Korea has a different size measuring cup. So even then, standards didn't really catch on all that much, although most of the world went to metric. So to this, I'm supposed to add flour to make a sponge. And the idea is that you just sort of add a little bit, you get a nice slurry, and then I'm going to put a lid on this and let it sit out overnight. The yeast will start to work on that flour. It'll start to create gluten. It'll start to create flavor. Okay, I'm going to switch to a whisk. And you just want to add enough flour until you're just a little bit thicker than a pancake batter. I know that's kind of vague, but it doesn't need to be any more than vague. And for anyone who was wondering, that was about 2 cups of flour. Okay, so I'll put a lid on this, and I'm just going to leave this on the counter overnight at room temperature. We'll come back to it tomorrow. So overnight, we got a really good looking sponge happening here. Look at that. Good growth of the yeast, fantastic. And so the next step here is fantastically vague. I love this. Make a sponge in the evening, let it rise overnight. So we've done that. In the morning, stiffen with flour and knead about a half an hour. So there's absolutely no discussion about how much flour to add or how stiff to make the dough. Just stiffen it. You're just supposed to know. And for people out there who need to know exact amounts, relax a little bit. Bread is very forgiving. You don't need to know exact amounts. So I started yesterday, I'd put about 2 cups of flour in. I'm not measuring this flour, but I'm adding about 2 more cups at this point. I'm going to put it on the stand mixer with the dough hook, and I'm just going to mix it together a little bit, see what happens. And yes, using a stand mixer is cheating. Electricity was pretty rare in 1892 in rural Ontario. In Ontario in general. Okay, so let's just check this. I'm going to say that's good. I've got enough flour in there. So roughly 4 cups of flour total for this recipe is going to get you there. Let's knead it, and then we'll move on. Okay, I'm going to say that this is done. It's been kneaded quite enough. Now the next instruction is when risen again, roll out 1 inch thick. So I'm just going to leave it in this container. I'm going to put a lid on it, and I'm going to let it rise again. Probably double in size. That seems to be the standard that everyone wants you to let it rise again. Depending on the temperature in your kitchen, could take a couple hours. It's kind of cool this morning in the studio because I just got out here, so it might take a little bit longer, but I'll see you in a little while. Now, this has risen very nicely. We've got a really nice light dough. The instructions get a little vague at this point. Not that they were very detailed to begin with. It says, when risen again, roll out 1 inch thick and put in pans. Now, pans is plural, so I'm assuming 2 pans at least, but it doesn't say what kind of pan. Is it a loaf pan? But it's called a coffee cake. So is it a cake pan? Is it a square cake pan? Is it a rectangular cake pan? Is it 2 9-inch cake pans? Is it 1 9x11 cake pan? Let's get it out on the board and see what happens. Okay. It doesn't say to punch it down, so I'm going to be fairly delicate with it. You're going to degas it. There's no way around that. But, you know, I'm not going to go out of my way to degas it. And let's see. Kind of sticky. I was on the fence about whether to put down any flour. I'm not going to roll it out. I'm just going to shape it into this 9x11 pan. This is a really nice dough. So, let's see. It's going to stick to the counter. I'm not going to worry too much about it. Get it into the pan, and we'll just shape it kind of like focaccia, almost. Okay, I think this looks pretty good. I've got it filling the pan, all the nooks and crannies. The next instruction is just to leave it until it's light, which I take to mean another little bit of a rise. So we're going to let it rise up to the top of the pan, which shouldn't take too long. This is a pretty aggressive rise that we've got going on all the way through. So I'm just going to cover it with a piece of linen, and we'll come back in 20 minutes or so, maybe half an hour. Now, the next instruction is to melt some butter and thicken it with some flour. And then I spread it on top of the cake before I put it into the oven to bake. So I put, I don't know how much, so I've put about 3 tablespoons of butter in this pan, and I don't know how thick to make it. Let's start with a good heaping spoonful. We'll mix that in and see where it gets us. Maybe just a touch more. Okay, so how do we spread this on top? And did I make enough? Okay, into the oven. Okay, so I've chosen 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm going to stick it in here and keep a close eye on it. It's a yeast-raised cake. It's essentially a bread, and bread is cooked when it reaches an internal temperature of about 190 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm going to let it go for about a half an hour, and then I will test it with an instant read thermometer and judge how much longer from there. Hey, Jules.
Hey, Glen. Hey, friends. How are you?
Is it cake? Is it bread?
Really?
Yeah. It's bread. I mean, really, it's bread, but it's a yeast leavened cake.
Yeast leavened cake.
Mm-hmm.
Is that craquelin at the top, or is it more like a... Oh, sorry. I totally got you there.
It's almost craquelin. It doesn't have sugar in it. It's just butter and flour.
Okay.
So it's craquelin light. That's really good bread. That's really good bread. I like that. Do you like that?
Well, it's very lovely to eat. I can see why, but it'd be really nice as toast. I don't know that I'd like it as a sandwich because it's a little sweet for that.
So there's sugar in it, not a whole lot. It's got a whole lot of flavor because it was in the fridge overnight with the yeast. And so that yeast has really worked in some flavor.
That really comes out on the edges. I really like the crispy edges. It would make really great pudding as well.
Yes, bread pudding afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
The dough is so nice and the flavor is so nice that if you, instead of cooking it in a pan, rolled it out and made it into cinnamon buns, this would be a really good dough for cinnamon buns.
So adding in that extra cinnamon, extra raisins.
Yeah.
And you could throw almost any kind of fruit in this, and really, it'd be lovely.
On the whole, I really like that. That is an excellent recipe for bread, even though it's a coffee cake.
There you go.
I've got toast for a week. Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.